All right, welcome back, everybody. I have my good buddy, George Gammon, on today. I'm super excited. George, welcome.
Tony, thanks for having me on.
Yeah, this is excellent. George, you've been great to me, helping me get started with my YouTube channel, and also just all around good friend, good mentor of mine, just helping to shape and calibrate just different things that I'm thinking about. So so here it is, July 4th, Independence Day. And I wanted to kind of ask you a couple of questions today. So the first one being, you are a world traveler. You're living in Colombia now. You grew up in the States, but you're living in Colombia now. You've been to Dubai, you've been to other countries.
40 plus, 45.
Well, yeah, so you have a really good perspective on freedom, not only here in the States, but also what freedom looks like abroad. Can you give the viewers a perspective of what you've experienced in those other countries in terms of freedom or lack thereof, and how we in the US should have a greater appreciation for what we do have?
That's a really good question. So let me go over some of the misconceptions that people have in that area. The United States is unique and good, I think, in the sense that if there's a rule or a law, for the most part, people obey it. For the most part, obviously, it's like you could use the example of speed limits. No one obeys the speed limit, really. And there's a few things like that, but for the most part, are compared to other cultures, I would say the Americans have a greater appreciation for rule of law. Now, I would argue there's some cultures that take it even more seriously, like the Germans. They really, or the Austrians or something. They really get it's got to be, everything has to be by the letter of the law. Where as Americans, we got some wiggle room there. But you go to other cultures where you've got some extreme wiggle room, where I say the laws are merely suggestions. And Colombia would be one of those places. So if you're looking for maximum, let's just say personal freedom, I think it's tough to do it by just looking at the rules that are on the books. And I think that's what a lot of gringos do, a lot of Americans, because we assume that if the rule is on the books, then people just have to obey it and the police are going to enforce it. But what you find in a lot of other countries is, although they may have some rules, although they might have some, let's just say on net balance, more rules than the United States, the personal freedom is a lot higher because no one even pays attention to them, and the rules aren't enforced at all. So that's one of the reasons why, if people are in search of maximum personal liberty and freedom, I always say that you've got to do some research online to determine, kind of from a 30,000 foot level, where you might like to spend time based on the weather, the food, the people, the culture, things like that. But then you've got to go there, and you've got to spend a month or two and do that boots on the ground research, because you're not going to get a true vibe for the levels of personal freedom just by trying to read about it online. That's not going to work. So that would be my first suggestion. Now, I think that one of the things that now we're kind of moving up from an individual level to more kind of the macro level. That's a big advantage that the United States has. And we discussed this last night on our mastermind group Zoom call, where the United States has decent, I would like to see better rule of law, but it has pretty good rule of law, where and what I mean by that specifically is where the law is set up to protect you against the growing size of government. And so, a lot of people would think rule of law, they just enforce the law. That's not totally how I see it, because that would imply that, the government could just grow and grow and grow and grow. And if they just enforce those laws, and that's somehow good, like Nazi Germany, I'm sure, had great rule of law, but that's not what we want.
Yeah,
we want
not good for the people.
No, not good for the people at all. So we want the rule of law that protects the people from the government. And in my view, and I'm no means a historian, but in my view, that's kind of what the Constitution does. And that's what the Federal Reserve Act does around what they do with their monetary policy and whatnot. And this is kind of the North Star, if you will. And so it protects the people from an expanding and ever-growing powerful government. And this is why when we just ignore the Constitution or try to pretend that it's some sort of living and breathing document, whatever that means, that just basically means we can ignore it. This is extremely dangerous. And even if you think that they should ignore the Constitution or we should change, and there you go. If you want to change the Constitution, change it. Don't just ignore it. We've got the ability to do that. But one of the decisions, and I first started, kind of thinking about this when gay marriage was a hot topic. I don't know if that was that maybe 2000, that was 13, 14, something like that. Because as a libertarian, I don't care. First of all, I don't think the state should be involved in marriage whatsoever. I don't know why anyone would need the blessing from a politician or a bureaucracy in order to get married. I don't, that to me is completely bizarre to begin with. But then to somehow say that we not only need the approval of the state, but then we need the approval of the federal government. I don't get that. Bizarre. And sure, there may be some instances where if you're technically married and your spouse gets hit by a bus and they're in a coma, you can determine whether to pull the plug. But I mean, come on, we're talking about, how often does that really happen here, And do we need to completely ignore the Constitution to make sure that that person has the right? And by the way, if you don't have the right, just go to a different state where you've got it.
Yeah.
Just move, for heaven's sakes. You're not a vegetable.
Yeah.
So that was kind of the first time I started thinking about it, because I think that anyone should be able to marry whoever they want. Who cares? But I looked at the Constitution, or just tried to do some reading over the weekend. I'm like, this doesn't have anything to do with anything in the Constitution. This is obviously, and if you look at the 10th Amendment, it's obvious that this is just a state issue. I mean, that's.
Give it back to the states.
Give it back to the state. Yeah. So then when they made that ruling, I was just like, wait a minute here. This is what we don't want, because even if you're in favor of gay marriage or you're in favor of the ruling, what you have to understand is that in the future, if you give the government, if you give the Supreme Court that type of power to just ignore the Constitution, which is the whole point of the Supreme Court, is to uphold the Constitution. But if you do that once, now you're on a slippery slope where you're going to do that most likely into the future. And the next thing that comes across the next topic that they decide on, the Supreme Court, that could be a topic that they decide in a way that you think is horrific and would be considered where they have to bend the Constitution to approve XYZ law. As an example, maybe you were in favor of gay marriage, but let's just say that the vaccine mandates went to the Supreme Court and they ruled in favor of the vaccine mandates. Well, they could only do that if they really kind of tried to circumvent what the true meaning or the true intention of the Constitution was. So what I'm saying is, once you give the government or the bureaucrats that type of power in the future, they're going to use it against you.
Absolutely.
You just have to understand that.
Yeah. And this is one of the things you've helped me think through, because, it goes back to the quote by Benjamin Franklin: a democracy is a great thing if you can keep it. Right.
Yeah. I don't even know if it's great, because I talked to Rick Rule the other day, and I've talked to him many times. And in one of our conversations, it's probably the first time I talked to him, we were talking about democracy, and he says basically it's two wolves and a sheep trying to decide what's for dinner. So it's not exactly perfect, but no. I think the point there that people need to understand is that we as human beings in an imperfect world, as imperfect creatures, we need to understand that there is no good solution.
Yeah,
There's no
no
perfect way
utopia.
to do. There is no utopia. We just have to select the best of the bad options that we have. And democracy may be it. And that the reason I say it that way is because we have to understand that democracy is full of flaws.
Mhm.
Because if we treat it as though it's a panacea, then we have this huge blind spot, right? And we've got to recognize that it's by no means perfect, and it may be suboptimal. I don't know. We can't just hold up democracy as though it's some sort of something that we need to worship. You know what I mean?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Especially, as we celebrate 4th of July, Independence Day here in the States, I've been thinking through our democracy and the fact that we have these three branches of government, right? The executive branch, the legislative branch, and like you've been chatting about the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, right? And so in my mind, the executive branch and the legislative branch have have fallen to a great extent because the people in those positions have succumbed to corruption, and they've in many ways lost their moral compass. And so at this point, it's just from their perspective, a lot of them are pushing a propaganda narrative which results in profit from them. And we've spoken about profit doesn't always mean, financial profit. Profit could be in the form of votes, right, for them to get reelected. So those two branches, executive and legislative, I feel have to a great degree fallen. And all we have holding up our democracy at this point is the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, right? Is kind of how my thoughts are going, and hopefully we don't ever lose that, because once we do, the question of the future of the United States starts to come into play. What do you
Yeah, and I
thought?
think that the Supreme Court is, or hopefully, should be a check on federal government. And that's, in my opinion, what the great purpose that it serves. And so, going back to your earlier point about the executive and the legislative branch kind of falling, I think it's kind of a chicken or egg type of question, where, in my opinion, I don't believe that I totally agree with you that they're massively corrupt and getting worse. But I would argue that it isn't necessarily because we've got the wrong people in there, which would be most Americans' view. It's because government is too big to begin with. And as you get a bigger and bigger government, you have to expect that the politicians that fill those positions will be far more morally bankrupt than the ones that filled the position when the government was much smaller. Because by definition, if the government is bigger, it's going and more powerful, it's going to attract people who want more power and who want power to rule over other human beings. And let's just face it, these people are pursuing their own self-interest. So this means that they cannot make as much money in the private sector as they can being a politician and just lying and telling you whatever you want to hear. So unfortunately, the way the as big as the government is now, it attracts the very worst of our society. It doesn't attract the best.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's the case today. Hopefully, we can turn things around. Richard Werner, he subscribes to smaller government, community banks,
Yeah.
that kind of model, right? So he's been speaking about that up front and center, and I think we could learn something from what he's been teaching overseas. So
Yeah,
appreciate
and
what
he's a
he's been
great
doing.
guy. He was at my last the Rebel Capitalist Live I did in Houston. He was nice enough to come in and speak to the group, and he's a really good guy, and obviously a fantastic thinker that I think everyone should follow and read his work for sure.
Yeah, so speaking of Rebel Capitalist Live, you just had a great event out in Miami. Congratulations. That
Yeah,
was
thank
awesome.
you.
What'd you have, like 500 attendees?
Nah, it's probably 400.
Okay, but still a huge event, huge event. I was there, great networking opportunity. And so what I want to do is three simple, fast steps, so to speak, of what are your three takeaways what did you take away from that event?
A lot of smart people are talking about recession. Number one. I guess another takeaway for me personally would be bonds may be interesting. Short-term bonds may be interesting from a standpoint of dry powder. And usually I talk about 4-week T-bills, but I'm thinking I might even extend that to 1-year and 2-year treasuries. I was talking about that, or I just tweeted about that earlier today. And especially if the Fed raises rates at the end of July, which I think is their next meeting,
Yep.
then, one of the things that Joseph Wang said to me, and he kind of made it just dawned on me, oh yeah, of course, when he said this, I've used a chart a couple times in some presentations at live events, not just my own, but in Belize and Scottsdale. I've been doing a lot of public speaking lately. And I use this chart of Fed funds that, we go up to 18% in 81, call it. And then every single time they go through a rate hiking cycle, they aren't able to get up to the previous high water mark before something breaks. And so last time they got up to 2.25%. This time they're at 1.5. But Joseph said, George, you got to realize though that although they're not at 2.25 yet, the market rate is pretty much the same. Therefore, it would be having a similar effect on the economy. And, it seems obvious, but it just, of course, there you go. And what he's saying is that although we're only at 1.5 now, we're the 10-year, as an example,
Yep.
is at a similar rate of interest today as it was when rates were at 2.25% back in 2018. So if the argument is that, that level of interest rates in the real economy would crush the economy, then we're already there. And I got to thinking, and then I pulled up some charts, and we're pretty much right on the money. If you look at monthly charts, now if you look at like daily or weekly, I think that we've moved a little bit higher. But if you look at like monthly charts of the 1 year and this morning I was looking at the 1 year, 2 year, 10-year, pretty much similar areas to where we were at 2.25%. So then the question I think becomes, why are they continuing to talk hawkish if the rates in the real economy are similar, if not higher? Mortgage rates would probably be way higher than they were. And I think the answer is because the CPI is at 8.6 instead of 1.8 or whatever it was in 2018. So that's really got, from a standpoint of my own personal portfolio, that's got me thinking quite a bit. And I know I'm going off on a tangent here, but to take it full circle, I think that if the Fed raises one more time, assuming they will at the end of July, say up to 2.25 or maybe 2%, then the rates in the real economy are going to be much higher than they were at the last cycle. And although I thought that was that things would break, which they have, right? So I think the big difference there, just thinking through this out loud, is that the idea in looking at that chart is that they would break something before they got up to the last high in interest rates at 2.2. And I think we can honestly say that they have broken something. I guess it's just now it's a matter of they don't care because the inflation is so much higher. Where if the inflation was at 2%, I don't think they would have, or they would have gotten up to 1.5. They'd probably be pausing right now, right?
Yeah.
So, yeah, go ahead.
No, so one of the Federal Reserve's charter is to control unemployment, and you had shared this before, and so maybe you can walk us through, this idea of the Phillips curve, right? And with the, so to speak, folks that we have on, I'm going to say unemployment today, yet they're not baked into the numbers because they either made their money via Bitcoin or the real estate market or whatever it is, right? We have folks who are technically unemployed, but not in the numbers. Yet the Fed raising rates would almost demand an increased unemployment rate. But because
Yeah.
we have so many people out of work, who have made money through stimmy checks, Bitcoin, whatever cryptos, whatever real estate they bought and sold, whatever, do you think the unemployment is a factor for the Federal Reserve? Do you think that's in their charter these days?
Well, I do, but in the opposite way in which people would think, meaning that their objective is low unemployment. And I think now their objective is higher unemployment because that's because they believe in the Phillips curve. So they think that's the best way to bring down the rate of inflation.
Yeah.
And to your point, I think we could go from, I think the key word there is voluntary, right? You're talking about how these people are unemployed because of their stimmy checks or cryptocurrency gains or 401k, home equity, whatever. And I think the key there is that they are voluntarily unemployed. With asset prices coming down as much as they have recently, especially if home equity starts to come down, their voluntary decision could be, I got to get my butt back to work.
Yeah.
Because I don't have, because all that purchasing power evaporated. So then the unemployment rate goes back up because you have an increase of supply of labor.
Yep.
And I think that's kind of what the Fed is trying to engineer with their soft landing, because they know darn well they can't take real rates positive. That's not going to happen. And I don't even think they would argue that they can normalize rates. So it's just a matter of how high do they need to take rates in order to bring asset prices down to where you increase unemployment to a level where it'll make a noticeable effect on the CPI. Yeah. And that's kind of the game they're playing right now. So that goes back to that earlier point I was making about 1 year or 2 year and holding your dry powder. Because for me, I'm trying to hold that dry powder to buy commodities. So if you're holding, let's say you buy right now a 2-year treasury, it's yielding, or even a 1-year treasury, is yielding like 2.8%. And let's just say that that's the money, the dry powder that you have to buy commodities, but you don't want to buy commodities until the price is a lot lower.
Yep.
If the price of commodities goes down, that would imply that we are going into a recession, or maybe better said, if the price of commodities goes down to a point where I would consider them cheap, we're most likely in a recession. And if that were true, the Fed would most likely pause, if not reverse. And if they pause or reverse, that means interest rates on the 1 year would go down. If interest rates go down, the price goes up.
Yep.
So you see what you're doing there technically. And I still need to think this through and poke holes in it. I'm going to talk to Chris McIntosh today and specifically try to poke holes in that. But I think that there's a good argument for, if you're trying to buy commodities, that you should keep you could keep the dry powder in like a 1 year treasury, because you're kind of getting a double whammy there, that if commodity prices don't come down, then you wouldn't have bought anything anyway, and you can just hold it to maturity at a 2.8% yield. And if commodity prices do come down, then that would imply that we're in a recession, interest rates come down, so you get a capital gain on the 1 year. So if you do need to liquidate in order to buy those cheap commodities, you're liquidating at a higher price, and then you can buy more commodities with the dry powder you had. So that's kind of what we're going to be talking about today with Chris McIntosh.
Yeah, no, that's going to be great. And that is going to be on your Rebel Capitalist Pro channel, right?
No, that's just like a normal interview I'm doing for the George Gammon channel. I don't know when it's going to come out. And usually when I talk to McIntosh, I talk to him for 2 or 3 hours. So we only put like 45 minutes of the conversation onto the interview. So,
gotcha.
But I'm personally looking forward to that one, because a lot of times when I interview people, it's just to kind of see what their thoughts are, see what they're doing, and just people I always respect and like to talk to. Yeah. But with McIntosh, he's one of those guys that I like talking to more so just for personal reasons, is trying to think through my own investment strategies, because he's one of the best sounding boards I know of.
Yeah, and that's the thing I love about chatting with, all you guys at Rebel Capitalist Live. And we spoke last night about it, is just the different commodities. What's happening out there. Is now the time to maybe do some dip buying? Well, maybe not. We spoke about the GDP now forecast, how that's being taken lower. Maybe for our viewers, you want
Way
to talk,
lower.
yeah, you want to talk about what happened within the last week on the forecast?
Yeah, I don't know if it was last week or last couple weeks, but they're basically at zero. Well, they started at like 2.5%
Yeah.
for
Where,
Q2.
yeah, how's it
And then
looking
they,
now?
well, and they took it down to zero. And then I don't know how much time it took them to take it down to -1. But as soon as they took it down to -1, like the very next day or the day after, they took it down to a -2, which I believe is where it is today. And that would mean that technically we're in a recession right now, if that comes to fruition, because the technical definition of recession is where you got 2 quarters of negative real GDP. In Q1, we were at -1.6, -1.5, something like that.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I think that along those lines, it's not just what that's telling us. I think when you look at that combined with the inversion of the yield curve, when you look at that combined with the price of gold, that what commodities are already doing and just collapsing, which I think is great. A lot of indicators out there would lead you to believe that there's a very, very, very high probability. And probably the greatest indicator would be Jim Cramer saying that there's not going to be a recession.
Hmm.
I think that's
Yeah.
probably the
Yeah.
best contrarian
Yeah.
indicator out there, that we're definitely headed for one, if not in one already.
Seems like whatever he says, do the opposite, right?
Exactly.
No, that's all good stuff. No, so we spoke a little bit about what goes on at Rebel Capitalist Live, just networking and all these thought leaders. Brent Johnson was there, and chatting with him at one point, he had shared with me, he's like, Tony, we're all just trying to figure it out, like the rest
Yeah.
of you guys. Right. He was just so gracious, such a nice gentleman to be able to have a conversation with. And, some of these economists or leaders supposedly get on television and they will be very, fanatic that it's going to be a certain way, when in fact, nobody really knows what's going to happen. Right. So I love the perspective that these guys at Rebel Capitalist Live bring, that it was just we're all just trying to figure it out, which was really nice.
Yeah, I think that's a great tip. If you're listening to someone and they're very absolute about their thinking, or if they're trying to, if the way they're talking is in terms of certainties and not probabilities, probably listening to the wrong person. Because what you'll find is, what I've noticed is, the greatest investors tend to be the people who are most humble, and the people who are always willing to admit that not only do they make mistakes, but their current views could very well be wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. No, speaking of Rebel Capitalist Live, I just can't say enough good about that event. The different folks, I took a lot away from Kenny McElroy. I loved his presentation on just different risks surrounding real estate. Not that you should buy or not buy. It's just trying to wrap your head around what's happening today. Chris Martenson talking about the energy commodity there and what's going on there, and how we may have already peaked in terms of global production, right? And what the future may hold for us. And then, Doug Casey finishing it up was just absolutely fantastic. It's just so wild to hear his thoughts. So great event. Congratulations on that. When's the next Rebel Capitalist Live coming out?
I don't know. That's a good question. I haven't even thought about it. I'm just going to I usually do them, or I have done them twice per year, but next year I'm just going to do one, and just kind of, I don't know, it might be April, or we haven't really figured it out yet.
Yeah, you guys have a lot going on. So I don't want to take a lot of your time. It is the holiday. I want to give you some time for rest and relaxation as well here on the holiday. How can folks find you, George?
Oh, they can just Google my name, or they can go to YouTube and just type in my name. And the George Gammon channel is mostly whiteboard videos and interviews. And then the Rebel Capitalist channel is the other one that I have, that just kind of live streams my, whenever I see a topic that I find interesting, I just kind of hit the the go live button, and Josh gets on there with me and we just talk about an article, or sometimes I do it 2, 3, sometimes I do it 4 or 5 times a day. Maybe 10, 20-minute little me just ranting or me discussing a specific article that I just saw on CNBC or Zero Hedge, something like that.
Yeah, no, it's all good stuff. So the George Gammon channel and the Rebel Capitalist channel, I follow both of those. And for the viewers, if you're not following those, definitely go to YouTube right now and subscribe. Those are great channels. So George, thank you very much. I appreciate you coming on the channel. Any last thoughts? Any last words?
No, I think that what you're doing is fantastic. I would really encourage people to start creating their own content. And even if you don't get 1 million subscribers or whatever, anyone that didn't improve their life dramatically through creating content, not just because first and foremost, the people that they're able to meet and talk to and just build their community and build their network. And it just gives you such a neat way to meet like-minded people and to share your ideas and gain a greater sense of community, even if it's online. And today, in today's day and age, we need as many people as we can out there talking about the ideas and the principles of freedom, liberty, and free market capitalism. So the more people that can get out there and start their own YouTube channel or write their own book like you did, do a blog, do a podcast, I mean, the better. I'm always trying to support people in trying to open up other people's eyes and push back against the authoritarians that we have in the world today.
Yeah, absolute words of wisdom right there. So we can end it here on life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on this
That's
Independence Day, my friend.
That's right. Thanks for having me on, Tony.
Excellent. Thanks for coming on, George. I appreciate it. You have a great day.
You too.